would you like to improve your health and keep your family safe? You're listening to the Healthy Home Hacks Podcast, where we firmly believe enjoying optimal health shouldn't be a luxury. Healthy Home Authorities and husband and wife team Ron and Lisa will help you create a home environment that will level up your health. It's time to hear from the experts. Listen in on honest conversations and gain the best tips and advice. If you're ready to dive in and improve your well-being and increase your energy, you're in the right place. All right, here are your hosts, biobiologists, authors, media darlings, vicarious vegans, and avocado aficionados, Ron and Lisa Barris.
Unless you've been living under a genetically modified rock laden with pesticides, you've likely heard of the Environmental Working Group's, or EWG's, Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce. In fact, they've been releasing this list for over 20 years. Yes, 20 years. It's comprised of the dirty dozen, the 12 fruits and vegetables that are the most contaminated with pesticides, and the clean 15, the produce with the lowest amount of pesticide residues, according to EWG's analysis of the most recent USDA data.
These lists matter in terms of your health, the health of the environment, but also in terms of your hard-earned money. So you can save money by purchasing conventionally grown produce that's lowest in pesticides and spend your dollars on organic produce with the highest number of pesticides. Think buying organic doesn't matter? Think again. Think it's just a small amount of exposure each day? Think again. Pesticides are toxic by design. They are created to kill living organisms. So today, we're going to dive deep into the potential health problems connected to pesticides, including brain and nervous system toxicity, cancer, and hormone disruption, especially harm to the male reproductive system.
We're digging up all of the dirt on your favorite fruits and veggies as we dissect the 2024 guide, which includes data from 47,510 samples of 46 fruits and vegetables, with our special guest, senior toxicologist Alexis Temkin from EWG, to ask her, is the government protecting me? Alexis Temkin's PhD supports EWG's consumer databases, policy and research in the areas of personal care and cleaning products, pesticides, and tap water. She began her research career at Columbia University Medical Center, studying the molecular mechanisms responsible for environmental influence on gene regulation. As a doctoral student, she studied how exposure to environmental toxins during development can influence adult obesity and metabolic syndrome. Welcome to the show, Alexis. Yes, there she is.
Thank you so much. That was the most exciting introduction I've ever heard.
Ooh, good.
We're excited about you.
We're excited. Welcome, Alexis. Thank you so much for being with us today. Where are you joining us from?
I am joining you from Washington, D.C., from the EWG headquarters.
Nice.
Our office. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Ron's old stomping grounds.
Old stomping ground.
Well, not the
Grew up in
headquarters.
Virginia.
Not the headquarters. He's not a stalker.
I'm not a stalker. I could be, but I don't live close enough, right? So I used to live in Reston, Virginia. So close enough.
Awesome. Yeah.
But Alexis, I want to kick off the show by what I call one of the biggest misconceptions. Isn't the government protecting me from pesticides used on produce today? Doesn't legal mean safe?
This is such a good place to start because you're right. It is a common misconception. And I think one of our favorite terms, we use it over and over again at EWG, not just for pesticides, but in other chemical safety questions, is that legal doesn't necessarily mean safe. That's exactly right. So when it comes to pesticides, you'll hear that a lot of these data, which is true, meet sort of the standards set by the government. But there's just more and more data out there that shows doses lower than those standards can actually have really profound and impactful health effects.
Yeah. And something that is rarely ever discussed is when these chemicals come together, right? The cumulative effect of multiple pesticides, those aren't ever studied, correct?
Yeah. So the way that EPA regulates pesticides is this kind of classic one pesticide at a time. But if you look at just some of the few sort of stats on our guide to pesticides in produce, some of these crops have up to 20 different pesticides on a sample. And across the whole crop, you can see hundreds of different pesticides used. So it's just not the reality of how people are exposed to pesticides, which is way more than one at a time. And that's really a scientific question that needs to be addressed if we're going to say, yeah, this is a safe practice.
Right. Really good.
Absolutely.
Very important to know, listeners, because I mean, we still have people in our community. Our community is really smart. I'm very impressed with our community. Most of them have been following us for a very long time and are pretty savvy, but there's still that misconception that if something's for sale, that means it's been thoroughly tested or it wouldn't be for sale. So thank you for clarifying that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Alexis, we get to ask this question all the time. It's a very general, easy question, but I wanted you to explain it. Can you explain what the term organic means?
Sure. So organic means that something has been certified by the USDA and their National Organic Standard Program. There's a variety of different sort of criteria that go into that. But when we think about pesticides, there's a very strict list of ingredients that can be used on ingredients. And you don't see the type of really harmful synthetic pesticides that are detected and showing up on residues in conventional produce. And one of the things that I talk about all the time when we talk about organic is that there have been so many studies now, time and time again, that show when people switch from a conventional to an organic diet, the levels and numbers of pesticides drop so rapidly. So, we sort of know not just that the standards that this is, a reduced pesticide or certain type of pesticide-free label, but there's also just this empirical data about how it can impact exposure.
Right. So, and that's interesting because how many people are actually getting their blood tested for pesticide levels? Like nobody, right? So,
yeah,
unless you're on a mission, right? Unless you're on a mission and you're testing this for a purpose. So that's really profound what you said. When you switch from a regular conventional diet to an organic diet, your pesticide levels in your body drops drastically. And we're going to get into the health effects of these pesticides and why that matters as we go through the show. But, that was all over the news like a couple of years ago that organic diets didn't matter. And that was some PR stunt by the pesticide companies or something. It's like, hello, that's just not true. But a lot of people believe those studies, right? Do you remember that one?
Sort of. I mean, it's an effective tool for reducing your pesticide exposure. And that is something we've definitely seen over and over again. And there's actually been a handful of reviews recently that show, an organic diet or a low pesticide diet can have some reductions in potential health effects. There are, studies that need to be repeated on big cohorts and things like that. But there's definitely encouraging evidence that, the pesticides on produce can have an effect on health. And like you said, we'll go into a few of those studies, I'm sure.
We'll get into that. Okay. So what you guys have been waiting for, drum roll, of the 46 items included in the analysis, which 12 fruits and vegetables were most contaminated with pesticides, otherwise known as the dirty dozen?
Yeah. All right. So we'll run down the list.
Yeah, let's give it to it. We didn't want listeners to have to wait too long for this list.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So we've got strawberries, number one. Spinach.
Alexis, no. Strawberries?
Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't really have a good coating.
They've been number one for a few years now. Yeah, strawberries. I know. Sad. Followed by spinach. And then our number three are kale, collard, and mustard greens. Kind of group those together. Grapes, peaches, pears, nectarines, apple, bell and hot peppers, another grouping in the pepper category.
Mm-hmm.
Cherries, blueberries, and green beans. Round out your dirty dozen.
She's really upset as she's reading this list. I feel like we need tissue. Okay. What's interesting about this list is those are all, I think every single one you mentioned practically is something that you wouldn't peel the skin off, right? You would just eat with the skin.
That's most likely.
When you were reading it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the skin, does it generally act as a protective barrier, like say a banana thick skin or avocado or something that you would peel?
Yeah, it can to some point. And I think what's really interesting or important about clarifying sort of around the data we use is that when the USDA collects their samples and they test them, for hundreds of pesticides, that's the source of our data. They're preparing the fruits and vegetables the way that a consumer would. So they are peeling things if they need to be peeled, like citrus or a banana. And they are washing everything too in the same way that consumers would, with just sort of like wash underwater, nothing super fancy. So the residues we're talking about and the rankings are based on washing and peeling. So it's residues that are left after you do those things.
Really?
And
Okay.
Interesting.
yeah. And
Something I read in the study, if you could explain real quick, how the EPA versus the USDA does the preparation. So can you kind of get into that? I think you just said am I saying that right? The FDA versus the USDA, I mean?
no, so I think just primarily that most of the data come from USDA. And I think it's this common misconception that you can just wash off pesticide residues and you have nothing to worry about. So we always like to say that it's important to know that these data come from washed and peeled. So it's stuff that's left over. And not washing and not peeling, you are likely going to have higher residues. So it's always good practice, not just for pesticide contamination, either just for general, like foodborne illness prevention and good food hygiene to wash fruits and vegetables. Yeah, dirt, all that stuff. But it doesn't take care of all of the residues.
Right. So that is why we want to buy organic produce if, for example, they're part of the dirty dozen, right?
Yes.
So that's the whole premise here.
That's the whole premise of this list.
The whole premise of this list is basically for people to eat lots of fruits and vegetables while reducing their pesticide exposure, right? So if you're always eating stuff on the dirty dozen, then it's maybe better to opt for those organic or choose the Clean 15, which has really low pesticide residues. And those are good conventional options. About 65% of the samples on the Clean 15 had no detectable residues.
Yeah, we're going to get in. Listeners, hang on. If you want to hear the Clean 15, you got to stay till the end of the show. That's our cliffhanger.
Ooh,
it's a cliffhanger. And one thing I want to divert. So there's the PLU code, I think it's called, right? Is it the PLU code on every fruit and veggie? Every produce has a code that's really there for the grocer. But as consumers, we can use that as a little detective label if we don't know if something is organic. Is that correct? So it'll start with a certain number. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that. That is something I will look into.
Ron and I made up an acronym to help us remember. Okay. 8's not great. So if the produce starts with number 8, that means it's genetically modified, the PLU number. 8's not great. 4 is a boar. 4 is conventionally grown. And that would be the numbers start with 4. That is not organic. And then 9 is fine. If it starts with the number 9, it's organic.
That's fantastic. I had no idea. I love that.
We'll license that to EWG.
It's a handy tool because sometimes in the grocery store, it will say like organic produce, but for whatever reason, it's butting up against the non-organic produce. So looking at the numbers gives you that validation that, okay, good. This is
genetically modified where they're not going to like put a sign saying it's GMO. So if you pick it up and you see the 8, now you know 8's not great. Okay, you don't want that. That's genetically modified.
We're all about handy tools. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Absolutely. Alexis, I read on your website that the CDC's biomonitoring program found between 2005 and 2016, 100% of Americans ages 6 and older tested had detectable levels of certain pesticides. Why is this exposure so rampant?
Wow. Well, there's so many ways to answer that question. There's a few different ways people can be exposed. So the CDC tests, I will also say the CDC only tests for a handful of these pesticides. So there's a whole bunch of this exposure that we are also missing in terms of our just national biomonitoring. So it's a small subset, and even that small subset, there's a lot of exposure. And there are different routes and ways you can be exposed to pesticides. So fruits and vegetables is probably the most common for the general population. But a lot of people also use pesticides, in their home, like to treat insecticides, or so you can have pesticide accumulation in dust or from nearby areas. But the truth is, some of this can also come from legacy pesticides. So like things that have been around for a long time that we don't use anymore, but they're really persistent, like DDT and things like that. You'll also see detections. But there's heavy pesticide use on agriculture in this country, and it leads to pesticide exposure in the general population. It was a long way to get there.
Wow.
Right.
You reminded me, Alexis, there was this old study a while back. It was on 550 different homes. I believe it was in the Northeast area. And this was 20 years after DDT was just banned from the marketplace. And they still found something like 50 or 60% of the homes had trace amounts of DDT in the carpeting. And it didn't leave. That was 20 years later, right? I like to see that test updated to see how much is left now.
Yeah. And the effects of that, the health effects, can also transfer to different generations. So there's studies. I mean, this is a little, you don't find DDT or like it's not sprayed now anymore, but the legacy of that can impact generations to come. And we're seeing that in some really interesting and unique studies that I think are coming out of mostly in California.
Oh, okay. Where we live. Thanks, Alexis. Yeah, no, it is. It's interesting because we don't think about pesticide exposure, say, at the golf course next to your home or the school or Disneyland and Disney World. Ron's mom lives right outside of Disney World, Ron's mom and dad. And, there's no mosquitoes miraculously at Disney World, like none. And it's good. We don't want to be getting like mosquito exposure to all those diseases. But at the same time, like that's being heavily doused with pesticides that people don't think about, insecticides in this case. Yeah. And so
and that can lead to other sources of exposure. Like if it gets into the water or is nearby. There's some regulations in California about school applications and being whether or not how close you have to be, but even those are not always going to be fully protective.
Yeah. So in the dirty dozen, getting back to the dirty dozen, 4 of the 5 most frequently detected chemicals were fungicides. Can you explain what these chemicals are and what they do to our health?
Sure. So I will at least say that there's over 200 different pesticides were detected across all the dirty dozen, but we wanted to take sort of a closer look to see what was coming up most frequently or what might be coming up in the highest levels, because that's ultimately going to impact exposure to some degree. And we found that fungicides were really prevalent, and 4 out of 5, right, of the top 5 were fungicides. And what's unique about fungicides too is that they're often applied like after harvest. So they're used to basically prevent like mold and mildew and that kind of growth. I think everybody knows like what happens when you leave something for too long and it gets moldy, right? But because they're applied after harvest and like much closer to when they're going to meet consumer shelves, the grocery store shelves, or be consumed, they can have really high levels of concentrations of these pesticides rather than something that's applied earlier in the growing season. And so again, they might meet, legal standards, but there's some evidence about these fungicides that suggests they could be endocrine disrupting chemicals. So for some of them, this one called fludeoxonil, we can see that it might block androgen receptors, which means it could potentially impact the male reproductive system, or sometimes it can act like an estrogen in these other cellular systems, right? So we need more studies, but there's these sort of concerning emerging evidence that made it something we wanted to highlight and something that, think needs a closer look in terms of whether or not these pesticides and the levels they're used at are safe.
Yeah. And one thing it's bringing to mind when you said like, yeah, there's legal levels that somebody deemed safe maybe 50 years ago, right? But today we know we've got so much exposure from so many different sources that these levels need to drop drastically in a lot of cases. Are some of these pesticides and fungicides not even, say, something that's being tested in the water? Like PFAS, there's legislation now where they're trying to ban 6 classes of PFAS from water, but that didn't even exist. So PFAS is in our drinking water, as we know, but it was not only illegal because there was no standard set for it. How could it be illegal if there was no standard? Is that the same case with some of these?
Yeah, I mean, the regulation of drinking water standards, PFAS is going to be the first one that's been developed in decades, I'm pretty sure. It's a system that really doesn't favor a lot of adding new regulation or finding chemicals to regulate. So there are definitely some regulations around pesticides, but a lot of these are really just based on dietary exposure. When EPA regulates a chemical, they will estimate how much could potentially get into the water. And again, say like, does this exposure exceed our safe limit? The real issue is that those safe limits are just set too high. So even if you have an idea of how much something might be in the water, if it doesn't meet that standard, it's not going to trigger anything. And a lot of the data that's made to set those safe standards are very old. It's submitted by, the companies that are making pesticides. That's the way the system is. That's the way the system is.
Conflict of interest for sure, right?
In every industry, I feel like, Alexis, we're talking about flame retardants, everything. It's cosmetics, fragrances, right? It's the industry self-regulating these. So they're bringing the safety data. Are you saying so the manufacturers of the test?
Yeah. And then academics or peer-reviewed scientists are kind of playing this catch-up game. Once you know that something is in the food, they say, okay, well, let's look at this in our system, which is much more sensitive, which looks at developmental neurotoxicity or indicators of, right, like reproductive harm that are more sensitive than the studies that are often designed and used in regulatory aspects. So it's always this catch up game. And then again, pesticides are regulated every 15 years is when you do this review. So something can be on the market for a very long time. And even if new data does come out, and even if EPA says, okay, we're going to consider this, you still have this whole long time that exposure is happening. And there's numerous examples of that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Hey, Alexa, circling back to fungicides, 2 of those fungicides were also found in the highest concentrations of any of the Dirty Dozen pesticides. Which 2 are these?
These are fludioxonil and pyromethanil. And both of those in that sort of same study I was talking about had indications that they could potentially harm the male reproductive system through, blocking the way that androgen receptors work or signal in the body, right? It's an indicator study. It's sort of preliminary evidence, but it's one of those things that we know in the way EPA regulates potential endocrine disruptors. They just aren't very good at it, to be quite frank. So, it's something that's worth doing more research on and understanding really the implications of these fungicides and all the pesticides on fruits and vegetables for human health.
And agriculture in general, too. So we're talking about coffee beans, right? And a lot of any agricultural product, correct? When we're talking about pesticide exposure can come from, right?
Yeah, I mean, the data that we look at primarily is just for these 46 fruits and vegetables. I actually don't know if the USDA has collected or tested coffee. It's the crop I'm not as familiar with.
Yeah. Ooh, new project for EWG.
Yeah.
We'll have you back and we'll talk coffee. Because coffee is kind of also a big topic that we've discussed because now they've come out with all these really wonderful brands like Purity Coffee and Life Boost Coffee. And there's a lot now that they're certified for no toxicity or low toxin. They're shade grown. They're tested for mold because coffee can be very high in mold. And I think about like how many people get their daily dose of Starbucks or whatever coffee they're drinking and don't even think about spending a little extra to get that in organic. And then you're subjecting yourself to toxins every day. And people are like obsessed with their coffee. So, they're not usually drinking just one cup. So that's just another thing I wanted to pop in there. But also, we're seeing a decline in male sperm counts and infertility and all of that, right? And so there's definitely, with these 2 fungicides you're talking about in particular, will you feel like that's a connected thing or it just needs further study? Or what would you say about that?
I think it definitely needs further study to make that connection. But you're right. There's a lot of really incredible studies that have looked at, they're called like meta-analyses, right? And they pull together different populations, different pieces of data. So you get a really big sample of the population that show, that there's been this overall sperm count decline or impacts on male reproductive health, male fertility. And the authors that have worked on this for a long time, do speculate that sources of toxic chemicals could be contributing to at least some of that. A lot of those authors worked on plastics, some pesticides, right? So it is this chemical cocktail, this mixture that we need to understand a little bit better. And it's just not how it's being done at the regulatory space.
Yeah. Atrazine. That's a whole nother show. Atrazine, they did that Berkeley study, right? They found that atrazine, one of the world's largest used pesticides, I believe, is linked to turning male frogs into female frogs and emasculating the male frogs. So like, I think it was 1 in every 10 frogs that was exposed to this atrazine was a male frog turned into a female. That sounds like sci-fi, but it's actually not. Anyone can look up the study. Are you familiar with that study?
Yeah. And the author of that study, Dr. Tyrone Hayes, was really, there was a lot of pushback in sort of how to interpret that study and the agricultural business and companies really trying to denounce and discredit that work. But atrazine is a well-described endocrine disrupting chemical. And it's also primarily a water contaminant. So you might not find it on fruits and vegetables, but in certain areas where it's applied really heavily, it can be found in the water sources near there.
Make its way to your drinking water. Yeah. Okay. And that's a whole nother topic too, filtering your drinking water. Okay.
Absolutely.
We need to be back. Okay. So 90% of the peaches tested positive for a potential hormone-disrupting fungicide that may harm the male reproductive system. Is that one of the 2 that you mentioned that was on 90% of the peaches?
Yeah, that's fludioxonil.
Okay, glutioxonil.
And right. Alexis, you also mentioned too that the worst of the Dirty Dozen was strawberries, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, 99% of the strawberries had detectable pesticide residues even after being washed. Now, question, would a vinegar rinse or any other home rinse work to remove this?
That's a really good question. So, like I said, these are all sort of washed in water, and that typically gets rid of some pesticide residues. So like if these had been unwashed, they probably would have had higher residue concentrations. There's not a ton of great data on, whether vinegar is the best or baking soda is the best or water is the best. So, and it might depend on the pesticide. So a wash is probably not going to get rid of everything. Water is definitely really good. But no, I don't know if anybody's done sort of a before and after vinegar wash on strawberries. It's actually a piece of research that me and another colleague at EWG really want to write a review article on, because there's so many questions about it. And to be honest, the answer is probably it depends. It's going to depend on the pesticide. Yeah, but definitely water is going to get rid of some, but not all of them, what this USDA data shows.
Alexis, when you do wash the vegetables and fruits, how is it washed? Is it like, what's the qualification? Is it like, 5 minutes in a tub and you dump it out? That's a rinse, or what would be the protocol?
No, I mean, I think the way the USDA does it is much more like I'm a consumer in a rush sort of thing, so rinsing under running water. And I think making sure that your hands are clean before, but also just sort of like rubbing produce, or sometimes you can use, again, a very clean brush can help get rid of some of that extra dirt, and like the abrasion can help remove some as well.
Right.
But again, like I don't think soaking in a tub, or as long as they're dried, running water is probably better than soaking because it's not standing.
Ah, okay. That's surprising.
Yeah. If you're sort of standing water at a certain temperature, right, you can also get growth. So I typically do running water.
I think what we see a lot on like Instagram is the tub, and you throw in all the produce, maybe with the vinegar and the water, and then you take out all the produce and you see all the dirt, and there's a false sense of we got off all the pesticides, but that could literally just be the dirt, and good news, maybe the bacteria and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. So like I said, there's not great data on like all of these empirical things on like which one is the best, but as long as you're washing your produce, it's going to help some. I do running water at home, or like a salad spinner is a good one for me for my leafy greens.
We do vinegar water combo, and we used to have a spray around. I forget which brand it was where we sprayed it. There's been a couple sprays we've had along the years, right? But then we realized they're really just vinegar. Most of them have vinegar in them, so we but I know baking.
Yeah, so we definitely recommend not using like detergents or sort of these like washes or things like that, because those can have other chemicals in them that just haven't been evaluated for safety or could leave other residues. So that's always a good thing to point out too.
I think we had an for sure we had an eco-friendly one, but I don't remember the brand.
Right. Well, I have a test question for Alexis. Alexis, it's Valentine's Day.
Ooh, putting her on the spot.
It's Valentine's Day, and someone you love near and dear to your heart just gave you a plate of strawberries with chocolate. Them? Or investigate first?
You throw the strawberries back in his face.
I'm going to eat them. Absolutely. Okay. So, I mean, the core message here also is that people need to eat more fruits and vegetables, and it doesn't matter which way they're grown, really. Like there's really not enough people are eating more fruits and vegetables. And there's so much data on showing that fruits and vegetables have protective benefits for a lot of health effects, right? So we want to get a lot of fruits and vegetables. So even if it's conventionally grown, eating more fruits and vegetables is going to be worth it. That being said, there's studies that show, like high pesticide fruits and vegetables might counteract some of those beneficial effects, right? So that's why you might want to opt for low or choose organic. But yes, if somebody's going to give me a plate of chocolate covered strawberries on Valentine's Day, I'm going to eat them.
Then
so Alexis chose love. She chose love.
Alexis is ready for. That's so funny. Okay, I'm going to give you a trick question too, because I don't think you're expecting this, and I don't even know if you've ever heard of it, but A-peel, this new coating that they're putting on produce to make the produce last longer, and it's showing up at Trader Joe's and a lot of these stores. Maybe Trader Joe's banned it recently, I can't remember, but it's a coating, and it's even being allowed to put on organic veggies, and a lot of people are kind of up in arms about it because we're not being told. There's no way to kind of know if the A-peel is there. Have you heard of that? Do you have any feedback on that?
I have not heard of it. No, I don't know what it is, but my guess is it's a tool that's probably being used to combat some of this fungicide issues. They're like, basically when fungus grows, you want something that's going to be protective. That's maybe not a fungicide. So if it's on an organic produce, it will have had to go through the organic standards. But again, like I'm making my note, I'm going to look up PLU codes. I'm going to look up A-peel and see what it is. Yeah. But no, I'm not familiar with it, unfortunately.
Okay.
Can't comment on it.
And then peel. Okay, good. Yeah. And maybe it's all natural. I've read mixed things about it. I guess one of the main issues is that it's sort of discreetly, and yes, you're right, it is being put on to make the produce last longer, but there's not really disclosure with it, right? So that we might have a GMO issue on our hands where remember how long it took to label GMOs? Like when they first came out, there was that. So now at least we know, well, we don't know if it has GMOs, but we know if it doesn't. They're going to let you know, right? If it's non-GMO. And guys, listeners, a lot of people get confused with this too. If your produce is organic, it is non-GMO, right, Alexis?
Yeah.
It is non-GMO.
Yeah, so that's one of the organic standards.
Yes. So it might have when you see something labeled the non-GMO project verified, that's great. But if it's organic, it is non-GMO, right? So that label encompasses actually even more than just the non-GMO.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, non-GMO. Something could be non-GMO, but the other things, it could still have pesticides. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be laden with pesticide. Yeah. So that can be a false sense of security.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to go from dark to light. Is this a good time? This is a good segue?
Let's do it.
Okay. Almost 65% of EWG's 2024 Clean 15 fruit and vegetable samples had no detectable pesticide residues. Let's move on to the Clean 15, the produce found lowest in pesticides. So which items made this coveted list, Alexis?
This is the Clean 15. Thanks for holding on, guys.
It's the Clean 15, and it honestly doesn't get as much recognition as it should sometimes. So I do really like this list. It's avocados.
Wait, let's drum roll. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So everyone knows like who the winner is and who got second.
Oh, are these in order? Are they in order?
Yeah, they're in order.
Okay. So 1 is the lowest in pesticides?
1 is the lowest in pesticides.
Did you say avocado? Of course you did. It's the perfect fruit.
Avocado, lowest in pesticides.
Oh,
avocado is number 1. Number 2, sweet corn. Number 3, pineapple. 4 is onions. 5 is papaya. 6, sweet peas. 7, asparagus. 8 is honeydew melon. 9 is kiwi. 10, cabbage. 11, watermelon. 12, mushrooms. 13, mangoes. 14 sweet potatoes and 15 carrots. I feel like I'm like singing a song about how many. Like all these.
Let's do it. Let's make up a rap song.
Alexis, we'll
Let's do a rap song about it. We need one so we can all remember it. That's cool. When you said onions, is it any onion? Was it yellow, red, green?
I think the way the USDA does their sampling is usually like a sampling of onions. So, each of these has hundreds of samples taken, and each sample is a composite of more individual samples. So, something that could meet the onion would be like red, yellow. I'd have to verify, but I'm pretty sure it's a variety of onions.
Okay, good to know. We are onion people. Those all had skins, thicker skins for the most part.
Yeah. So for the fruits, in general, right, you definitely see things that have less skin or are less peeled on the Dirty Dozen. I happen to be a particular fan of tropical fruits in general. So these are my favorite fruits, the ones that are on the Clean 15.
Yeah, I know. Kiwi, what else? The melons, the pineapple.
Papaya, mangoes.
I mean, sweet corn was not as dramatic. I'm not really eating sweet corn.
Corn. People like corn.
But that sounds good. I'm glad it made number 2, right? But the big winner was avocados.
No bad fruit or veggie run.
I know it's all good. And by the way, we're vegan, so we love this list. Thank you for sharing with Alexis.
Yeah, let this list be your new smoothie recipe, guys listening. You can throw all this in your Vitamix and be on your way with like low pesticide exposure, all these antioxidants that you're going to get from all these fruits and veggies, right? They're just loaded with and you're right, Alexis. I think like fruits and veggies don't get enough credit for how many healing benefits and nutritional benefits and minerals and vitamins and antioxidants and all of this that's in the produce, right? And we're kind of in this vibe of this fast food, lab grown, food system that we're getting further away from the natural foods. Now, frozen foods, do you think that's just as good to eat and or better?
Yeah, well, so I will say frozen fruits, our recommendations are usually if it's frozen on the Dirty Dozen, try not organic. If it's frozen on the Clean 15, but frozen foods are a really good way to get fruits and vegetables into your diet. That might just be more practical in some ways than a fresh fruit and vegetable all the time. So it definitely goes in line with that, like eat more fruits and vegetables for sure. And if frozen is the best option sometimes, then like that's a good way to get fruits and veggies into your diet.
Yeah, I agree. It is a lot more convenient, let's be honest. So
it's great for smoothie stuff.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Sad to see your stuff wilting. Well, Alexis, do you have anything that you want to leave listeners with? Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, just like to emphasize this tool, it's really supposed to be a tool, right? It's supposed to help you make the decisions you want to make for your family in a way that you can eat more fruits and vegetables and reduce your pesticide exposure. So it's kind of the best of both worlds.
Yeah, right. I mean, people really look for this list every year. I know I'm one of these nerds, when it comes out, I'm like, oh, and you guys do like a big, it's coming. So it's,
Yeah.
it's like a movie premiere for us in the health community.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
Alexis, we wanted to end on a high note, but I did have a question I forgot to ask earlier. Can you share about pesticides in baby food? Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, sure. So I will say, I will put a plug into stay tuned for next year for more baby food, because basically the way our data works, so it comes from the USDA. They sampled a small amount of baby food last year, and they're doing a whole nother round of sampling this year. So we'll have more data next year to talk about it. But we did take a look at the data, and baby food is interesting because there's a lot of good news there compared to the baby food in the 90s, which really sparked a lot of legislation around making sure that children were more protected from pesticides. Baby food has way lower levels of those really toxic pesticides that we saw in the 90s. So there's a lot of good news there. That being said, baby food still has pesticides in it. And so there's more work to be done in that regard. And then next year, we'll have more data and a better look at what the pesticides in baby food look like.
Something new. Okay. Up your organic.
Yeah, something new.
Okay.
But yeah, exactly.
Okay, mamas, stay tuned.
Yeah.
That's coming. All
and
right.
Again, we recommend, sorry, I was going to say that we just recommend our Clean 15, right? For baby food options, Clean 15 are probably good, conventional, organic for the Dirty Dozen. So same thing goes for baby food.
Okay, perfect. Okay, very good to know. Very important with babies with their developing bodies, that you're being extra careful with what you're feeding them as they grow. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Alexis. You can learn more about the 2024 Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce at ewg.org/food news. And we will have the link in the show notes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexis. And thank you, friends. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. We'll have all the links in the show notes at ronandlisa.com/podcast. See you on the next episode. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexis.
Bye. Thank you.
This episode of the Healthy Home Hacks podcast has ended, but be sure to subscribe for more healthy living strategies and tactics to help you create the healthy home you've always dreamed of. And don't forget to rate and review so we can continue to bring you the best content. See you on the next episode.